Chapters 37 through 50 of Genesis detail what happened to Joseph in what is commonly referred to as the Joseph story. But it's very interesting that right after the Joseph story begins in chapter 37, chapter 38 is an episode inserted about Judah and Tamar. It kind of seems out of place, but the biblical writer has a hidden double entendre in the text that gives us important insight and also helps to explain why this story about Judah that doesn't seem to fit has been included in that precise location. Now, you know that I'm going to make you wait to the end to find out the details, but it'll be worth it. So stay with me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. To put the story of Judah and Tamar in context, let's back up for just a minute and review the key plot points from chapter 37. At the beginning of the Joseph story, Judah was not a good example, and this is an important point. Like his brothers, he resented his father's favoritism toward Joseph. Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons and gifted him with an ornate robe that represented his father's favor. The brothers' jealousy and hatred toward Joseph increased with his dreams and his tattling. So when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers, they saw him in the distance and plotted to kill him. Reuben convinced them not to harm him and instead to throw him in an empty cistern. So they grabbed him, took off his special robe, and threw him into the cistern. I just want to comment here that a cistern is different than a well. A well is something they dug to access groundwater, whereas a cistern is something they constructed to catch rainwater and store it. So if a particular location got sufficient rainfall, then the rainwater could be collected and stored during the wet season to provide a supply of water during the dry season. And the Bible does specifically mention that the cistern Joseph was thrown into was empty. Now, the Bible lets us know that Reuben intended to return Joseph safely to his father, but while the brothers ate, they saw a caravan passing by. It was Judah who proposed selling Joseph as a slave. Then they tore Joseph's coat and stained it with the blood of a goat and presented it to their father, letting him draw the natural but incorrect conclusion that Joseph had been torn to pieces by a wild beast. When Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, mourning many days for Joseph, everyone tried to comfort him, but he said, "No, I'll mourn him until I join him in the grave." So imagine the level of heartlessness of Judah and his brothers. Not only did they plot against their brother, but they stared in the face of their distraught, devastated father and held their tongue. They let him suffer for years with intense grief. This was the character of Judah, the ancestor of David and the Messiah, when we first meet him at the beginning of the Joseph story. And Judah's behavior in the episode in chapter 38 isn't any better. He left his family and married a Canaanite woman. Surely that would have been looked upon unfavorably by his family. Abraham had sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac and made him swear that he wouldn't get him a wife from the daughters of the Canaanites. Esau's Canaanite wives caused bitterness of spirit for his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. So we can assume that Judah's marriage to a Canaanite was contrary to what his father would have wanted. Also, let me clarify something that's often misconstrued. It's just a minor point, but some people read the verse and think that the name of Judah's wife was Shua. But Shua was a masculine name, and the Hebrew is worded in such a way that it makes it very clear because it reads, "and his name Shua." So Shua was the name of the father of Judah's wife. So Judah participated in a terrible crime against his brother. and now was casting off restraint and taking a wife who would have been unacceptable. She bore him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And here's where the plot thickens. Judah's oldest son, married Tamar. We don't know her parents, but she was probably a Canaanite also. Was wicked, so God caused him to die. Since Tamar was a widow and childless, Judah gave Tamar to his second son, Onan, to be his wife so that she could have a child to carry on the name of her first husband. This was based on the levirate marriage custom, which is described in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. Onan was expected to marry her and raise up seed for his dead brother. But Onan knew that the firstborn son would perpetuate the family of his brother, so Onan purposely avoided getting Tamar pregnant. And this was wicked in God's eyes, so God caused Onan to die also. By custom, Tamar had a right to marry the third son, Shelah, but Judah did not want to give his last son to Tamar because he was afraid that he might die like his first 2 sons. So Judah gave an excuse about needing to wait until Shelah grew up. And in the meantime, Tamar was expected to live as a widow in her father's house. A couple of points here are important. Since Tamar was a widow and childless, she basically had no legal, economic, or social status. Also, there is some debate as to whether or not it was appropriate for her to be sent back to her father's household. The Bible doesn't mention a dowry, but some scholars believe that it would have been customary. The point of a dowry paid by a father for his daughter was to support her if this type of situation arose. But others point to Leviticus 22:13, which mentions a priest's daughter who is widowed and without children going to live in her father's house. So it's possible that this was a custom that became part of the law later. Now, if she had had children, then she would have remained in the family of her husband and under his protection. But Judah sent her to be under the protection of her father because she was childless, and he still ultimately had authority over her. Because Judah was denying Tamar her right to the third son, even when he came of age, Tamar decided to take matters into her own hands. After Judah's wife died, Tamar decided to get a son for her deceased husband through Judah himself. And of course, you know the story. She dressed up as a prostitute, positioned herself along the route that Judah would be taking to go to Timnah or Timnath for the sheep shearing, which was usually a very celebratory atmosphere with great feasting. Tamar got Judah's attention and had sexual relations with him. As a promise of future payment for her services, Judah asked her what she wanted. She requested his signet, cord, and staff. A signet, also known as a seal, was used in ancient times to authenticate documents. It was a common form of identification. Signets were often made of stone and engraved with a symbol or a name to identify the owner. They were typically very small, but they were important. Usually a person with a signet was prestigious. Now, there are different types of signets, but in Mesopotamia, typically the signet or seal was an inscribed cylinder. Cylinder seals had a hole drilled through the center. A pin was typically inserted into the hole, and then it was threaded into a cord. In this way, the seal could be worn either around the neck or on the hand, wrist, or a belt. The second item she asked for was the cord. Now, the cord could have been one of 2 things. It could refer to a part of Judah's clothing, like a belt or tassel, but more likely it would have been the cord that held his signet, and it would have then enough slack to allow the signet to roll freely across the clay to make an impression in it when it's being used. The third item she requested was his staff, and this was a symbol of leadership and authority. It may also have been used to designate a person as the head of the family. And it may also have had some type of distinctive identification on it because the top of the staff was typically engraved. Now Tamar returned to her father's house and put back on her widow's clothing. Judah did send the goat for payment so he could get his 3 items back, but the prostitute could not be found. Later, when Judah found out that Tamar was pregnant, he thought that she had had illicit sex, so he ordered for her to be burned to death. But at the last moment, she revealed the 3 items to prove the identity of the person who had gotten her pregnant. When Judah recognized his 3 items, he said, "She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son." Judah had denied her what she was rightfully entitled to. She had done what was right for her deceased husband, since Judah hadn't. So Judah allowed her to live, and Tamar gave birth to twins, Perez and Zerah. Perez was an ancestor of King David and Jesus. So why is chapter 38 nestled in the Joseph story? Well, let's see for a minute how the Joseph story progresses. We know that after several setbacks, Joseph ended up becoming second to Pharaoh in Egypt. Due to a famine in the land of Canaan, Judah and his brothers went to Egypt to purchase grain. Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. After accusing them of being spies, he detained Simeon and sent the others away, requiring them to bring their youngest brother back if they wanted more grain. Of course, Jacob was beside himself with the thought of losing Benjamin, and Reuben stepped forward and promised to return him safely. On the second trip, when Benjamin was caught with the silver cup in his sack, the brothers could have abandoned him, but instead they tore their clothes and they returned to the city. Now notice how the focus is on Judah in the next scene. The Bible says that Joseph was in the house when Judah and his brothers came in, and they threw themselves on the ground before him. When Joseph confronted them, it was Judah who spoke up, saying, "We are my Lord's servants, both we and he also with whom the cup is found." Joseph told them that he only wanted Benjamin and they could go in peace. Was he just trying to get Benjamin away so Benjamin could stay with him? Or was he also testing his brothers to see if they would be happy to get rid of Benjamin like they did to him? Judah approached Joseph and tried to explain the situation. He concluded by saying that he was surety for the boy, and he said to Joseph, "Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad, a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. For how shall I go up to my father, and the lad be not with me? Let peradventure I see the evil that shall come on my father." So once again, it was Judah who took the lead among his brothers. But what a difference. The first time in chapter 37, Judah was jealous of Joseph and hatched the plan to get rid of him. But now in chapter 44, Judah was not jealous of Benjamin, and he offered himself as a slave so that Benjamin could be free. Before, he let his father live with the devastation of losing a son, but now he wanted to protect his father. This reversal is so dramatic that there must have been some type of transformation of Judah's character. Well, that transformation is hinted back in chapter 38, and in 2 ways. And so I think it helps to explain why the episode is placed where it is in the text. In verse 26, after recognizing his signet, cord, and staff, Judah talked about Tamar and said, "She hath been more righteous than I." But in the original Hebrew, an equally plausible translation is, "She is in the right, not I." This confession was a turning point for Judah. Because of Tamar's actions, He experienced some type of self-realization. He acknowledged his error. Now, there is also some deeper significance hidden in chapter 38 in a double entendre that points to this transformation. A double entendre is a phrase that can be interpreted two ways. And remember that in Hebrew, names of people and places are important. They mean something. So let's look back at chapter 38, verse 14. And the King James Version says, "And she put her widow's garments off from her, and covered her with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place, which is by the way to Timnath." Now, the Hebrew reads a little differently. It says, "And she sat in the entrance of a Naim that was on the way to Timnah or Timnath." So Tamar deceived Judah at a place called the entrance to a Naim. Now, the word for entrance is petach. It can also mean opening. The Hebrew word Enaim is the proper name of a place, and it also means springs, or the meaning of the word is springs or eyes. So the physical location, the geographic location, was probably given that name because it had natural springs, and springs are watery circles on the ground. The same word, Enaim, refers to our eyes because eyes are watery circles on our face. So we can think of this phrase in two ways. The entrance to a naid can also be translated as the opening of the eyes. The author is skillfully letting us know that this is the place in which Judah had a transformative experience. At the place that refers to the opening of the eyes, Judah's eyes were opened to his need to change. And Judah ultimately realized that Tamar was more righteous or in the right. From this turning point, Judah got his life back on track. He developed into the type of person who would sacrifice himself to save his brother. And he ultimately became the ancestor of King David and the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of All Things Apostolic.